The wind stirred the prairie like a restless child, pulling long grasses sideways and whispering across the dry, cracked earth. Overhead, the sky hung vast and gunmetal gray, churning with the promise of a storm. And from the north, along the old cattle trail, a man rode alone. His name wasn't known to the land, not yet, but the set of his jaw and the worn grip on his rifle told stories without needing words. He was not young, but not old either, weathered, tight-lipped. A streak of gray threaded through his dark hair, and there was something cold in his eyes, a quiet intent, like a wolf that had tracked its prey for days. The horse beneath him was lean and tired, but sure-footed, and it carried him with the patience of one who had made long journeys before. Ahead lay a ranch, low-built, timber-framed, tucked beside a stand of cottonwoods that lined the creek. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and pale, the scent of juniper wood drifting on the air. He watched it for a time from the ridge, unmoving, the rifle laid across his saddle. This was the place. The man he'd come to kill lived here. He let the wind decide his moment. At the house, she moved like someone accustomed to silence. Her name was Miriam. She wore a long skirt stained with flour, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair braided back in a simple rope. She looked younger from a distance. Up close, there were lines around her mouth that came from more than laughter, and her eyes were the color of thawed river ice. She was kneeling in the earth, her hands working over a row of struggling herbs by the porch. Something stubborn in her kept trying to grow them, though the soil here was thin and the sun unkind. When she heard the hooves, she didn't rise. She looked up, one hand brushing dirt from her palm, and met the stranger's gaze as he rode in slow. No alarm, no call for her husband. Just a moment of stillness, then a quiet nod, like she knew already this was a man the earth had spat out with a purpose. "You're far from the trail," she said, voice low, even. He dismounted without answering, tied his horse, shouldered his rifle. She noticed his boots were dust-caked and split at the seams. He'd come a long way. "I know who lives here," he said finally. "That right. Miles Rankin." She didn't flinch, just stood and brushed her skirt. "He's out mending fence, might be back by dusk." The man looked toward the distant hills. He seemed to measure the time. Then, to her surprise, he leaned the rifle against the porch and removed his hat. "Mind if I wait?" That was when she turned, went inside, and left the door open behind her. She made tea the way her mother had taught her, slow and steady. Boil the water. Use dried mint from last spring and a pinch of willow bark for the ache in her wrists. She poured it into 2 tin cups and brought them out, steam curling between them like breath in winter. He was seated on the porch now, staring out across the yard, but he stood as she stepped down and offered the cup. There was something uncertain in his hands as he took it. She noticed a long, jagged scar along his forearm, old but deep once. A story there too, no doubt. They drank in silence for a time. "You plan to kill him?" she asked at last. Not cruel, not afraid. Just a woman who had lived with hard truths long enough not to dance around them. He looked at her sharply, but her gaze didn't waver. "Yes." She took a sip, then sat beside him, her cup resting on her knee. "You come all this way to do it clean." He nodded. Man deserves a bullet. She let that settle between them. Somewhere out near the shed, a crow called once, then fell quiet again. "I suppose you'll tell me why before you do it," she said, "if you've a conscience left." The man hesitated. He looked down at the tea in his hands like it might help him find the right words, but he said nothing, not yet. She didn't press, just sat with him as the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to hit the porch roof, soft and spaced like a ticking clock. There was something odd in the quiet that followed, not peace, not tension, but the strange, in-between stillness that comes before something breaks. The rain didn't last long, but it left the air smelling clean, the dust darkened and clinging to the grass roots. A hush had fallen over the land, the kind that settles in the wake of weather when even the birds seem to pause their song. The man stayed on the porch. His coat, hung from a post to dry, dripped steadily. Miriam lit a lantern as the light began to fade, its glow catching the fine bones of her face through the window. He watched her move inside. She didn't hurry. There was no trace of panic in her posture, no sign she intended to fetch a rifle from behind a cabinet or send word down the trail. She moved like someone who had known violence already and was no longer startled by the weight of it on her doorstep. He remembered her name now. It had surfaced in his mind as the rain fell. He hadn't known what she looked like before, only what was written in old letters and one brittle newspaper clipping. But the name matched the steadiness in her voice. Miriam Rankin, born Miriam Lowe. Her family had lived north of the Cimarron until the cholera took 3 of them and drove the rest to ruin. He hadn't expected her to be so still, or kind. That rattled him more than he'd admit. When she opened the door again, the lantern light spilled onto the porch. "You'll stay for supper," she said, not a question. He shook his head once. "I didn't come for comfort." "You came to kill a man. That kind of thing ought not be done on an empty stomach." She didn't wait for agreement, just turned and walked back inside. It was the scent that drew him in, onion cooked down with beef fat, flatbread warming near the coals. Hunger had been his shadow for weeks, but he'd kept it buried beneath grit and focus. Now it stirred, unwelcome but undeniable. He stepped through the door and took off his boots. The house was small but tended with care. One room held the stove, a table, and 2 worn chairs. A shelf near the hearth bore a scattering of books, most of them water-damaged, one bound in blue velvet. There were stitched curtains at the windows, their thread fading in places but intact. She set the table without ceremony. 2 plates, 2 knives, no need for talk. She served stew from a dented iron pot and tore the bread in half. They ate in silence again, but this one felt different, less like distance, more like a kind of grace. It was only when the food was gone and the fire low that he finally spoke. "I knew a man named Caleb Lowe," he said. She looked up at that, not startled, not softened, just alert, like an old dog hearing a sound it remembers from long ago. "My brother," she said. "I was with him in Kansas 12 years back, before he married, before everything." Her hands stilled on the table. "He died in a flood," she said, her voice rougher than before. "No," he said. "No, he didn't." The silence that followed was not quiet at all. It buzzed with old ghosts. She stood and turned from him, her back to the stove. He stopped writing. That's all I ever knew. He stopped because he was shot, left to die in a ditch behind a saloon in Atchison. Bullet through the lung, took him 2 days to go. I was there. Her hands curled around the edge of the counter. "He was trouble," she whispered. Maybe, but he didn't deserve how it ended. The man who shot him didn't do it clean. It was a coward's killing, over money. Now she turned to face him, eyes shining, not with tears but something harder. "And you think it was Miles?" "I know it was." She studied him for a long time. "How?" He pulled a folded letter from his coat, yellowed, creased 100 times, set it on the table. "I found this in Caleb's things, your name in it, so's his. Said he was heading to see your new husband. That Miles owed him from a card game back in Wichita. He never made it past the next week." She stepped forward, touched the letter with the tips of her fingers, didn't open it, just stood there, staring at it like it was a knife. "My husband never mentioned him," she said. "That doesn't surprise me." The fire popped. She sank into the second chair, looked small there but not weak. "I need to ask," she said after a while. "You came here thinking I'd stand aside, that I'd let you do it without a word." "I didn't expect kindness, but I came for justice." She nodded slowly. "And if you're wrong?" He didn't answer. Outside, the wind was rising again. A lone coyote howled somewhere beyond the hills. Inside, the 2 of them sat, neither willing to yield just yet, but something had shifted. The tea was cold, the fire low, and a reckoning was inching closer with every tick of the lantern's sway. Dawn broke slow and colorless, the sky the pale belly of a winter bird. Frost lay on the window panes in delicate, curling whorls, and the creek behind the house ran sluggish with ice. The fire had died to embers in the hearth. In the hush before movement, the stranger lay awake on the floor, blanket barely warm, eyes open to the wooden beams above. He had not slept much. His body ached from the ride, from years of old injuries, but more than that, it was the conversation that gnawed at him, Miriam's steady voice, the way she hadn't denied the accusation, but hadn't confirmed it either. She hadn't begged, hadn't wept, only listened. That was more unsettling than any protest. He rose quietly, wrapped himself in his coat, and stepped outside. The land looked washed and hollow under the new light. There was no snow, not yet, but the air held that sharp, waiting stillness. He walked to the creek and crouched, dipping his hands in the water. It bit at his skin, clean and pure, and for a moment he felt young again, before the killing, before the running. He had buried Caleb with his own hands, dug the hole himself, covered it with stones. There had been no lawman, no priest, just prairie wind and the buzz of flies. He remembered the way Caleb's fingers had clawed at the dirt in the end, how he kept gasping for water he couldn't swallow. And all he'd said again and again was he knew, he knew, he knew. When he came back to the house, Miriam was already up. She'd lit the stove and was kneading dough at the counter, sleeves rolled, her braids slightly undone. She glanced up as he entered but said nothing, just motioned to the pot of coffee on the stove. He poured a cup and sat. "Fence is down near the south line," she said, voice even. "Coyotes got through last night. I need to check on the calves." "I'll ride with you." She raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to do chores for a man you came to kill?" He met her gaze. "You said he'd be back by dusk. I'm not one to wait idle." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "There's another saddle in the barn. Gray mare'll carry you if you're patient with her." By the time they rode out, the sun had pushed past the clouds and lit the land in long amber strokes. Grass sparked with frost. A pair of hawks circled far above, silent and watchful. They rode in a quiet that wasn't unfriendly. Miriam led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who had patched this land together with her own hands. She pointed out fence posts where the line sagged, where the wire had snapped. He worked beside her, driving stakes, pulling wire taut. Their gloves brushed once, and both drew back, not startled, just reminded. It was just after noon when they found the calf, caught in a snarl of broken fence, its leg torn and bleeding. Still alive, breathing shallow, eyes wide with pain. Miriam dismounted first. She knelt beside the creature, murmuring low. He watched the muscles in her face shift, not soft, not hardened either, but braced. She reached into her saddlebag for a cloth, pressed it to the wound. "It won't last the night," she said quietly. He crouched beside her. "There's mercy in ending it." Her jaw tensed. "There's mercy in trying." He handed her a flask from his coat. She poured a trickle over the leg to clean it, then bound it tight with slow hands. They fashioned a sling from rope and canvas. Together, they lifted the calf across his saddle, and he walked beside it as they returned, steadying the weight. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold. Miriam walked ahead, her face unreadable. Back at the barn, she made a bed of straw and covered the calf. The creature gave a soft sound, between a bleat and a whimper, then lay still. Its chest rose and fell. "You ever seen something live when it wasn't supposed to?" she asked him. He nodded slowly. "Caleb did once, took a bullet just under the ribs, should have died then. Took me 3 days to get him to a dock. He limped for years, but he made it for a while." She didn't look at him, just leaned on the stall door and watched the calf breathe. "Miles saved my life," she said suddenly. He turned. "Back before we married, there was a man, drifter mean, thought no one miss a woman like me. Miles stopped him, shot him in the gut, didn't let him finish the job." The stranger didn't speak. The words hung heavy in the barn air, where dust danced in shafts of light. "He's done wrong," she said. "I won't deny that. He drinks too much, gets cruel in the quiet way. But he gave me a place, a roof, a name, and sometimes that's all a woman has to hold on to." He wanted to say it wasn't enough. That Caleb deserved better. But he saw something raw in her, something that couldn't be dressed with judgment. The sky had begun to darken by the time they walked back to the house. Smoke curled from the chimney once more. A raven sat on the fence post, wings hunched against the wind. They both stopped when they saw the horse on the ridge. One rider. Miles Rankin coming home. Miles Rankin rode like a man who owned the dust beneath his boots and the sky above his hat. His coat flared with the wind, old dark and cracking at the seams, and the rifle slung across his saddle was polished, well kept. He did not wave. He did not hurry. Just made his way down the ridge at a steady, deliberate pace, as if he'd seen the stranger's horse tied to his post and already weighed what it meant. Miriam didn't move. She stood beside the porch, one hand at her hip, the other hanging loose. Not afraid, but bracing, like a tree before the first break of a storm. The stranger stood beside her, his own rifle untouched, leaning against the porch rail. His coat flapped softly behind him, and his jaw clenched once, then stilled. Miles dismounted with a grunt and tied his horse. His face was hard, sun-leathered, with a scar like a fishhook above one brow and eyes the color of old ash. He saw the stranger and did not ask a name. "Long ride to visit strangers," he said, voice low and rough. "Longer if the strangers got answers I need," the man replied. Miles looked to Miriam. "You let him in." "I did." Miles's jaw worked once. "You give him supper, too." "I did." He gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Then I reckon we ought to sit, talk like men. Seems there's trouble come crawling." Miriam didn't move, didn't blink. "No more talking in this house until we've washed and eaten. You'll do both." For a moment it looked like he might protest. His shoulders squared. But her eyes pinned him, and something old passed between them, a recognition forged by shared winters and too many small wars. Without a word, he turned and went to the pump to wash. Inside, supper was sparse: cold beans, salted pork, last night's bread, but it laid between them like an offering of peace or truce. They ate with their knives in silence. Then the stranger reached into his coat and laid the folded letter on the table once more. Miles looked at it without touching it. "You know who wrote that?" the stranger asked. Miles nodded. "Caleb Lowe." "You remember him?" "I remember a man by that name, tall, ran a crooked game, claimed he had a stake in everything." "He came to see you," the stranger said, 12 years ago." Miles's eyes narrowed. "He came to threaten me, claimed I owed him, said he'd take it in flesh if I wouldn't give coin." "You killed him." Miles leaned back, breath steady. "No, I put him out. Told him if he came near my land again, I'd break both his legs. Last I saw him, he was riding south, drunk and muttering. If he died, it wasn't by my hand." The stranger stared long and hard. "He died that week, bullet in his side, name on his lips." "You think that means it was me?" "I think he trusted you. I think you betrayed that." For a moment, it was only the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint pop of the fire. Then Miles stood slowly. "I've done things I ain't proud of. Lied, stole, struck men who didn't earn it. But I didn't shoot Caleb Lowe. That's the truth." Miriam watched him. Her face didn't change, but something in her chest seemed to ease. The stranger turned to her. "And you believe him?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. "I believe he's done worse things than he's saying," she said. "But I believe him when he says he didn't pull that trigger." Miles turned to her, something like surprise flickering in his face. "He came here to kill me, and you." "I gave him tea," she interrupted, "and a name, because it's what you never gave him." Miles opened his mouth, closed it again. He looked at the stranger, something hard behind his eyes. "I don't know what you came here looking for," he said, "but you won't find peace digging up graves." The man stood then, took his coat. His eyes passed over Miles, then to Miriam. They lingered there. "I didn't come for peace," he said. "I came for the truth. If I've got it, then I'm done." He stepped out into the cold night, the door shutting behind him. Miriam sat still for a long time, then rose and moved to the hearth. She stirred the fire, added a log. Miles sat down again, slower this time. "He'll come back, you think?" "Only if there's something left unfinished," she said, quiet as wind through dry grass. And outside, the man stood beneath the stars, hands clenched in his coat pockets, a different kind of weight pressing on him now, heavier than a rifle, quieter than vengeance. He had come to kill, but he had not yet left. The next morning came brittle with cold. Hoarfrost covered the fields, turning each blade of grass into a shard of glass. The stranger had not ridden off in the night as expected. Instead, he'd slept in the barn beside the ailing calf, a blanket pulled up to his shoulders and the rifle at arm's reach. He'd kept one ear open, listening for boots on gravel, for a door creaking open behind him. But no one came. When Miriam entered at first light, carrying a shallow pan of oats and boiled mash for the calf, he sat up and met her eyes without rising. "It made it," he said, still breathing. She knelt beside the straw and set the pan down. The calf twitched, eyes fluttering, nose wet. "I figured you'd be gone," she said, not unkindly. "I meant to be," he said, "but something don't sit right." She didn't press, just watched him as he stood, blanket falling away, steam rising faint from his shoulders. He looked older this morning. Not weaker, just worn in a way she recognized, in a way she carried herself. She led him back to the house, where she set a skillet on the fire and cracked the last of the eggs. Miles was already gone, had saddled his horse at dawn and ridden out toward the west pasture without a word. She'd let him go. There were things he needed to carry in silence and miles of open land to wear them down. Over breakfast, the stranger spoke again. There was a man who followed Caleb sometimes, called himself Deke. Thin, blonde, always wore that gambler's smile. You ever hear that name? She looked up from her plate. Deke Harlan. That's the one. Her mouth tightened. He passed through here, not long after we settled, tried to trade me a silver ring for a night in my bed. What happened? Miles beat him near to death, took his horse and sent him walking. I remember the limp he left with it. He stared into his coffee. Deke hated Caleb, thought he stole from him, back when they were running games in Wichita, always thought he'd find a way to make it even. You think he followed him to Atchison? I think he shot him in the dark, blamed it on fate, and walked away clean. And you came here thinking it was Miles. He looked up at her, finally. I came here needing someone to blame. You find enough ghosts on the trail, you stop asking if they're yours to chase. She reached out then, slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over his. It was rough, calloused, cool from the morning air. Her touch didn't offer comfort exactly. It offered truth, and he hadn't realized how much he needed that. They didn't speak for a long time. Later, as the sun crested over the hills and the frost began to thaw, Miriam stood and tied her braid with a leather cord. I need to ride to the post station, she said. There's a parcel I've been waiting on. I'll come, he said, rising. She didn't argue. They rode single file along the narrow trail that led down into the valley, through groves of bare cottonwoods and across the frozen creek. He saw the land differently now, not as terrain to conquer, but as something earned, patch by patch. Every fence post told a story. Every hoofprint pressed into the mud marked a choice. At the station, the postmaster handed Miriam a small, wrapped bundle. She tucked it into her coat without opening it. On the ride back, he asked, "What is it?" "My mother's Bible," she said, "the only thing left from our old house." He nodded. "You still believe?" She tilted her head slightly, thoughtful. "I believe in mercy, and in the good it takes to offer it." They rode on. That night Miles returned late, his coat soaked with sweat and wood smoke, a gash across one hand. He didn't say what had happened out there, and they didn't ask. He set his tools down, poured himself a cup of water, and stared long at the man sitting at his table. "You staying?" he asked. The stranger looked to Miriam, then back. "I haven't decided." "You got a name?" He hesitated, then said, "Daniel." Miles nodded once. "Well, Daniel, the fence needs mending. You want to eat here, you earn your keep." Miriam met Daniel's eyes across the room. There was no smile on her face, but something warmer, something that didn't need naming. "I'll start tomorrow," Daniel said, "at first light." And just like that, something shifted again. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a place carved out from the cold, a place to rest. For now, winter set in slow that year, inching down from the northern hills with a deliberate, quiet hunger. Snow came in thin layers at first, dusting the rooftops and softening the harsh lines of the land. The creek froze in patches. The wind grew sharper, carrying with it the low whistle of coyotes and the far-off groan of trees settling under ice. Daniel stayed. He didn't speak of when he might leave, and no one asked. Some mornings he helped Miles haul wood from the ridge, neither of them saying much, their breath fogging in the cold air. Other days he worked the barn, mending a broken stall, lining it with straw so thick the cold couldn't bite through. He moved like a man unlearning his past, one task at a time. The calf healed, slowly, awkwardly, with a crooked limp, but it lived. Miriam named it Sparrow for no particular reason, though when she said it, something flickered in Daniel's chest like a match catching light. Evenings were quiet. The three of them sat around the hearth, sipping broth or weak coffee. Miles carved bits of wood into rough animal shapes, hands steady. Miriam stitched a quilt from old shirts. Daniel read aloud from the velvet-bound book with the cracked spine, a habit that started by accident and settled into rhythm. Some nights it was scripture, others a tale of a woman shipwrecked on an island of glass. They never spoke of Caleb again. But in that silence, something healed. One night, long after the others had gone to bed, Miriam found Daniel still by the fire, staring into the orange coals. She poured him a cup of water and sat beside him. Her hands were red from the wash, her braid loose and trailing over one shoulder. "I used to think grief was a place," she said softly, "somewhere I'd wandered off to, like if I could find the path back, I could be whole again." He looked at her and there was no judgment in his eyes, just waiting. "But it's not," she said. "It's something you carry, you learn the weight of it, how to shift it from one shoulder to the other, but it's always with you." He nodded once, so's forgiveness. She turned to him then. "Have you found it?" "For Miles," he asked, "or myself?" "For both." He thought for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I've stopped looking for someone to bleed in place of it." She reached out and took his hand, just once, just briefly, but it was the kind of touch that didn't ask or promise, only recognized. The snow thickened by February, the roads vanished beneath it, the world shrank to the house, the barn, the line of fence posts leaning against the white, but inside there was warmth. Daniel built shelves for the pantry, fixed the door hinges, taught Miles to read the marks on Caleb's letter, not because he needed to know, but because it mattered to Daniel that someone else understood it too. One morning the sun came out strong, turning the snow to water. Miriam stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the melt drip from the eaves. Daniel joined her, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded against the light. "Spring coming," she said. He nodded. "You think the calf'll make it through?" "She's tougher than she looks." He glanced sideways at her. "So are you." She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth turned up just enough. "You planning to ride on once the trail clears?" Daniel looked out over the pasture, where Sparrow hobbled through the slush head high. "I thought I might," he said, "but every time I saddle up, something tells me I ain't finished here." She reached over and took his hand again, this time without letting go. "Then stay," she said, "not to forget what's behind you, but to build something that don't look like it." He turned to her then, and in his face was something she hadn't seen in a long time, hope, uncertain but whole. He came to kill a man. But what he found was a woman who gave him tea and something heavier than forgiveness, a place to be forgiven, a place to lay down what he'd carried too long. And in the deep quiet of that land, under a sky stretched wide with morning light, he stayed.